Arizona straight to the line. There's the snap to Murray. Murray looks left, pumps once, looking. A lot of time. Now he throws, and it's intercepted by the Lions. Picked off down the left sideline. Oruwariye picks up a block at the 30, 25, 20, Amani 10, 5, and he's spun out of bounds right there. I see you, 24. I see you.
Welcome to another edition of the Twentyman in the Huddle podcast. And if you guys have been following along, I've had a ton of guests. We've talked to some coaches. We've talked to some NFL people. We've gotten some players on. And look, it's an exciting time, and I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. I'm going to go solo here, and we're going to give an introduction to training camp. We are exactly 1 week away from the start of training camp, and I also have to warn you guys, I'm dealing with a little bit of a cold here. I'm getting over it, so I'm gonna try to power through this, but we should be good. And look, it's exciting, right? Training camp is here, which means football is here. And so today, I think what I want to talk about is 5 position groups and/or position battles that I'm really going to have an eye on that first week of the season. And I think, let's just start with the linebacker position, because I think there's probably a lot of question marks, and you guys and gals would probably agree that, that's one position group where, there's a little bit of some unknown there. Now, obviously, you have, the veteran Alex Anzalone coming back. He was, a guy who was a starter last year, played pretty well. Just kind of one of those solid guys that isn't going to make a ton of mistakes, though, one of the things he does need to clean up is some of the missed tackles that we saw from last year. But overall, he's just kind of one of those solid guys. And then, obviously, bring back Derek Barnes. And I think when you're talking about Derek Barnes and going into his second year, we talk all the time about, what's the biggest jump guys make in their football careers. Typically, it's from that first to second season, right? I mean, now you're kind of stable in what you need to do. You now have an off season where you can work on perfecting your game. You're not training to run 40s and verticals and all this other stuff. And so that's why we typically see that big jump from year 1 to year 2. And I think the Lions are expecting that with Derek Barnes. And I think the encouraging thing for you guys, when you come out to camp or when you see him play early on, is that when you looked at the totality of his rookie season last year, he got better the second half of the year. He got better as the season went on. And so I think when we talk about rookies, that's the encouraging thing, right? Is a guy making the same mistakes week 2, week 3, and then making them, week 12, 13, 14. And I think that's the encouraging thing with Derek, is that he wasn't making the same mistakes at the end of the year that he was at the beginning. He got better. And so, I think he's going to benefit a little bit from this change in scheme in front of him. The Lions are going to an even 4-3 front, an attacking front, whereas last year they were a 3-4 read and react. And there's a little bit more pressure on the linebackers in that kind of scheme, and in that read and react. You've got to play off the offensive lineman. It's more of a read and not an explosion and hit the hole and get into the backfield. And I think Barnes' skill set, I think, is a little bit better suited for that 4-3. And so, that'll be an interesting one. So, obviously you've got the incumbents with Anzalone and Barnes coming back, but I think there's going to be a lot of names in the mix, not just for those starting spots, but for key roles as well. And I think 2 names that I don't want you guys to sleep on is Chris Board, veteran free agent signed from Baltimore. He was their third down specialist as a linebacker, really great coverage guy, core special teams guy. And I love special teams guys and what that translates to the linebacker's position, especially when you talk about third down and playing in space, which, look, you guys know, this game is so much about sub packages, and you're in the nickel defense 70% of the time, and you've got to have linebackers that can cover, that can battle these dynamic tight ends, these dynamic running backs that have become, really matchup weapons in the NFL. And I think Chris Board is a guy that I think can do that for the Lions, and I think because of that skill set, he might be their best cover linebacker. I think you might see him playing more on defense. And guys, don't be surprised at all that first week of camp if you see him playing with that first team defense. I thought he was that good in the spring, and it's a name that a lot of Lions fans aren't talking about, but it's one that I think we're going to see early on, and we could see a lot of him. And another one I want is Sean Dion Hamilton. And, Sean Dion Hamilton, a veteran guy who was injured last year in camp, spent all last year on IR. But I'll tell you guys, he was going to make the 53-man initial roster if not for that injury. So, the Lions obviously love his skill set as well. He's pretty versatile. So, everybody talks about, Anzalone and Barnes and Jared Davis coming in, and those are talked about a lot. But Chris Board and Sean Dion Hamilton, two guys that I think could really put themselves in a position to be an important part of that linebacker battle, at least early on in camp. Guys like Anthony Pittman, Woods, I think those guys will be in the mix too. I think more, of course, special teams guys, but they show that they can translate and play defense as well. So, I think out of all the position groups, that one to me is the most unsettled heading into training camp. I think guys are really going to get an opportunity to compete. And look, when I talked with Calvin Shepard, the linebackers coach, he loved that about that room. Guys know, look, there's no $50 million quarterback here. There's no first-round draft pick that's going to be put in, and maybe he's going to take his lumps, pay his dues a little bit, but you're going to get him in there because of what you spent to get him. There isn't that guy in this linebacker room. It's going to be the best guy. And the guys that make the most plays early in camp. And so I think that's going to be a really, really interesting position to watch. It's one that I'll have my eye on early and often. It'll be part of, camp observations, which you guys know I do every day. But I'll probably put something along the linebacker position in that every day, just because I think it's so important, obviously, for this defense's success, for that group to be better too. They just need more production from that group. And they can get it. And one thing that I think will be interesting to watch with the linebacker position as well is Julian Okwara and Austin Bryant. Now, those guys, obviously, we know them as pass rushers, but this spring, they were part of the linebacker room. They're kind of splitting their time. Julian was playing in space and playing an outside linebacker role. And I think the benefit with him playing that kind of spot is, one, he's athletic enough to do it, but two, is you can now move him around and you can use him as a matchup weapon. The same thing with Austin Bryant, who came on strong last year too. So, not only will you have the guys we talked about at the top, but kind of hybrid guys like a Julian Okwara, like an Austin Bryant, who can spend some time in the defensive room, spend some time in the linebacker room. Those guys could be in the mix for that Sam spot or Will spot too, which will be interesting as well. So there's just a ton of stuff going on with the linebacker position, very unsettled, and that's one position I'll definitely have an eye on very early in camp. And I think we'll just transition right over to, I think, an area where it went from a position of kind of question mark, maybe needing depth, needing more talent, to really adding that kind of top-end talent and depth. And now it's a position group where you look at it and you're like, wow, Detroit might really have something there, and that's a wide receiver. I mean, you talk about DJ Chark coming in, and he was obviously a big free agent signing. He's a 1,000-yard receiver, 6'4", 4'3" guy, one of the best 50-50 pass catchers in the league. And when you looked at this Lions offense from last year, they needed a guy that could be on the outside. They needed that X guy, right? That could play outside the numbers, that can make plays down the field, that could dictate coverage. And in the red zone, it was particularly lacking, where the Lions were one of the fewer the Lions threw to an outside receiver, some of the fewest in the NFL last year among all 32 teams. That just wasn't part of their repertoire in the red zone. And you saw some of the red zone numbers lag because of that, because they didn't have that threat. It just got too congested in the middle because there wasn't that threat on the outside. And I think DJ Chark provides that. Then obviously, Brad Holmes makes a huge move, goes from 32 to 12 to get Jamison Williams, who I would argue would have been the first receiver off the board if not for the ACL injury he suffered, in Alabama's championship game. And so, to me, those are two really big additions. I mean, those are two guys that can be on the outside. They can be that X, especially when we talk about Williams, who's probably a 4-2 guy when he's healthy. a guy that can dictate coverage. Teams are going to have to put a safety over the top. And one thing I think we should talk about with Williams real quick too, and one thing I should explain is, he might start camp on the pup. Head coach Dan Campbell didn't seem very optimistic that he'd be able to go for the start of camp. And so what you do is you put him on the physically unable to perform list. And just if you guys don't know how that works, essentially, and the rules have changed almost in favor of Williams in Detroit and any other team that's going to start some guys on pup, is it used to be if you were on the pup list and you did not come off the pup list in training camp, you started the season on pup list, you had to miss the first 6 games. Well, then you have to come back and practice, and usually it was probably about half the season you were out. Well, those rules have changed now too. That's 4 games. So if Williams does start the season on PUP, he's got to stay on that list for 4 weeks, 4 games, and essentially he could be ready that 5th game if Detroit wants to get him back on the practice field and thinks he's ready to go. Now, I think there'll be some practice time associated with that, and the bye week is week 6, so kind of keep that in mind too. That could be a target date for him. And who knows, maybe, he has talked about being ahead of schedule and wanting to be back for camp, but something tells me the Lions are going to take it a little bit slow with him. I think they should take it a little bit slow with him. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's on the PUP list. And, that kind of affects what's going to happen, down the roster a little bit too. And, I think the interesting part about that receiver room is obviously you got Chark, you got Williams, you've got Josh Reynolds, who was a guy that came on the second half of last year and really gave them something. I think that familiarity with Jared Goff was really important for that room and for Jared as well. And you saw his numbers once Reynolds arrived really tick up, and obviously you've got Amon-Ra St. Brown, who I think is going to be kind of one of those go-to guys, one of those security blanket type guys for Jared Goff. I think you saw what he did to end last year with the 6 games with at least 8 catches, and the rookie of the month in December, and just was really dynamic. And like we talked about with Barnes, you just expect him to be even better in year 2 now with an off season, and he had a terrific spring, and him and Jared were really on the same page. And so you've got those 5. I think the interesting part here is now what are you talking about with 6 and 7 spots? I mean, and to me, you should be excited if you're a Lions fan and you sit down and you look at this roster and you start to see Quintez Cephas is possibly your 6th guy. I mean, here's a guy last year that was off to a terrific start. If he doesn't hurt his collarbone week 5, he's a guy that averages over 15 yards per reception for his career. And I would argue he's probably Detroit's best all-around guy, and by that I means a run after the catch. He's physical. He can get downfield. He can kind of do a little bit of everything. And now we're talking about him possibly being our 6th guy. And another name to bring up too is Trinity Benson. Obviously the Lions traded for him right before the season last year. Admittedly put too much on his plate, and he was thinking too much. He wasn't playing fast, and that speed element is just a part of his game. And I think one of the encouraging things in the spring is we saw him playing much faster. He's got the playbook down now with a year, under his belt, and I think it's going to be a terrific battle there between Quintez Cephas, and Trinity Benson. To really, who's that 6th guy? If the Lions started to keep 5, but they start Jameson Williams on pup, who's that number 5 guy? Is it Quintez Cephas? Is it Trinity Benson? Can a guy, like Cole Pimpleton, put his name in the mix, an undrafted guy out of CMU who made a few plays in the spring. So when you look at this receiver position, to me, where it was last year, even heading into camp, to where it is right now, I mean, night and day. I mean, Brad Holmes did a terrific job of really transforming that position group, and it's going to be really interesting to me, how that plays out, and it's really going to come down to practice in the preseason. But it'll be a fun one to watch, kind of where the bottom of that wide receiver position kind of fits in. I think it'll be really interesting, and I'll have my eye on that one. And then that shifts to obviously the guys who are going to be getting those guys the footballs, and that's the quarterback position. You've got to feel pretty good if you're the Lions about where Jared Goff is, at least where he finished last year. Once Ben Johnson took over as pass game coordinator and head coach Dan Campbell took over play calling, I mean, Jared Goff was 3-2-1 in his final 6 games with 11 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, and a passer rating of over 100. And, now Johnson transitions to the offensive coordinator role. He brought in Jared this offseason. They went and looked at film and said, hey, what are the things you did really well when you were having those Pro Bowl seasons in LA, when you were taking the Rams to the Super Bowl? What were some of the things that you guys really excelled at as an offense? And they built some of those things into this offense, and Jared's really taken ownership of it, and I think that's huge for him. And I think you've got to be pretty excited about, where he's at. He's very motivated. Obviously, he knows it's a big year. You guys know it's a big year. Everybody knows it's a big year for Jared Goff. He's going to have, a top 3 offensive line if those guys can stay healthy. DeAndre Swift is this emerging running back. He's got a Pro Bowler at tight end and TJ Hawkinson. We just talked about the wide receivers. It's time, right? I mean, he's got all the pieces around him now to succeed in an offense that he helped create. And so he knows that this is a big year. If he's going to be the Detroit Lions starting quarterback of the future, if he's going to be a starting quarterback in the NFL in the future, this is a huge year for him. And I think where it'll get interesting, though, is what happens behind Jared. I think that's the one that you really look at in training camp and you're interested in is it Tim Boyle or is it David Blau? And look, the Lions didn't go sign a veteran quarterback this offseason. They didn't go sign or they didn't draft a young rookie guy to develop. They have a ton of confidence in Tim Boyle and David Blau. And, a little bit interesting to me because obviously you look at Tim Boyle last year, got an opportunity to start 3 games, was 0-3, 3 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And I think one of the things that I concerned me a little bit, I should say, when it came to Tim Boyle was just how much they kind of limited that offense. They limited that playbook with him. And now look, he got hurt in training camp, injured his thumb and was on IR and wasn't back at practice very long before he was asked to step in and play. I think it was in Cleveland, his first one. And, that's a tough spot. It's a tough situation to be in, not having a lot of practice time coming from injury. And you've never started before, right? He was a career backup in Green Bay. But I was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't able to push the ball down the field, at least early on. And I know it was bad conditions in Cleveland. And like I said, he hadn't practiced very long, but you've got to have confidence to me that your backup can step in, your offense doesn't change. Maybe little things here and there, but that offense that first week with Tim Boyle was nothing like what we saw with Jared Goff. That's a big difference. Now, I think it got a little bit better as Tim Boyle moved on and started some more games, but I think to me that's one of the things I'm going to be watching in camp is can Tim Boyle, when he steps in, when that second team offense steps in, does the offense change? Is it still look the same as when Jared's in there attacking down the field, which we expect the Lions to do a lot more of, play action and being aggressive. And I think that'll be an interesting one for me is, does it look different at all? And if it does, I think that's a little bit concerning. Then we talk about David Blau. He obviously got his chance to start in 2019 when Matthew Stafford dealt with injuries. And look, he's a Texas gunslinger, right? You look at David Blau and you'd probably never guess that he's an NFL quarterback if you didn't know. But he's got amazing arm talent. And look, he's not afraid to throw the ball anywhere. It gets him in trouble, here and there. In those 5 games he started in 2019, he had 4 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. And Lions were 0-5. So, but I talked to Mark Brunell, the quarterback's coach, this offseason, and he said, look, we've got a ton of confidence in this guys. We think in these guys. We think that is a great room. And look, if David has to step in, if Tim has to step in, we have all the confidence in the world that, they've now been in this system a year and the system's changing, evolving a little bit, but those 2 guys have been there every step of the way along with Jared. And so the Lions are confident despite the 0-8 combined starting record between Tim Boyle and David Blau. The Lions think if they have to step in and play that they can do it. And so to me, it'll be really interesting. David Blau Blau took second team reps, split them with Boyle in the spring in OTAs and mini camps. And so to me, that tells me that competition is pretty tight. And that's really just going to come down to, I think some of those key practice situations, that Dan Campbell loves to put these guys in, put them in the hole. Can they lead these guys down the field, get a score? Those situations are going to be key. And then obviously the preseason games. And the joint practices, I think, are going to be a key element to this too. Didn't have them last year, obviously with Dan Campbell being new, and just the list of things he had to take care of was so long that was maybe 174 on the list. And, once he got to it, it was just a little bit too late. So I think that'll be key going to Indy, and especially for those guys, the whole roster, but especially for Boyle and Blau. They're not going to, know the defensive personnel they're throwing at. They're not going to be familiar with the defense. That's going to be an opportunity, for a real good look for this coaching staff and Brunell and, offensive coordinator Ben Johnson and for Campbell to really assess these two guys. And I think that'll go a long way in deciding who is, the number 2 quarterback. But that's an interesting one. I mean, those guys got to play well in camp and in preseason. That offense can't look different, and that's what you need from a backup quarterback. They've got to be able to step in and steal a win for you. You obviously hope Jared Goff plays 17 games, and we don't worry about this. But if they've got to step in, do Lions fans have confidence that Tim Boyle, David Blau can win them a game? I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see this preseason, how those two play and who kind of, separates themselves and kind of what that means for Detroit if and when they have to play. So we've covered linebacker. We've covered the wide receiver position. We've covered quarterback, the backup quarterback job. I think another interesting one for me is going to be that cornerback spot. You look at last year, Amani Oruwariye, I think, kind of ascended into that number 1 caliber type role. Obviously, you saw the ball skills with the 6 interceptions, but you looked at opponent's completion percentage against him, quarterback rating against him. Those were all among the tops in the league. And he's got size. He's got a ton of confidence right now. And I think he's kind of a number 1 caliber type guy. And so the big question mark is what's happening on the other side. And obviously, Jeff Okudah is going to be the storyline to start camp, because I do think he is going to start camp on the roster. And there could be a pup there, but from all the videos that he's been producing, plus you saw him do the walkthrough portions of the practice, working on the side and things like that, he looks ready to go. And from all the talk of the coaches, it seemed like they think he's going to be ready to go, week 1 of camp. And I think that first practice, we're going to see Amani Oruwariye on one side, and we're going to see Jeff Okudah on the other side. Look, he's former number 3 overall pick. You're not the number 3 overall pick for no reason. He's got size. He's got the skill set. He's got speed, strength, everything. It's just been injuries, right? He's played in 10 games his first 2 seasons in the league. And so if he can stay healthy, look, this is a kid who's hungry. I can tell you that much. I mean, he hears the talk, right? I mean, is he a bust? Is he this? Who else could the Lions have taken at 3 that would have been better? Whatever it is, he hears it. And look, no one's more angry and upset about 10 games his first 2 years than Jeff Okudah is. And so I just have this sneaky feeling, guys, we're going to see something from Jeff pretty early on here. He is definitely very, very hungry to prove that he can stay healthy and that he can be an elite type corner. And look, if he lives up to that, and you've got Amani on the other side and how he's developed, I think that can be a really good, 1-2 tandem on the outside. To me, where my eye's going to go, at least early on in camp, is what happens in the nickel. I talked off the top about all the sub packages on defense and how this has become a matchup league, right? And teams are in their nickel package over 70% of the time nowadays. So that nickel guy is essentially a starter in my book. And look, you return A.J. Parker, the undrafted guy last year, earned that job week 1 and played pretty well. Like we talked about with Derek, too, a guy who got better as the season went on. I thought that was AJ, and I think it's going to be a terrific competition between him and now you brought in a veteran guy like Mike Hughes. Now Mike played mostly outside for the Kansas City Chiefs, but last year, but when he was in Minnesota, he played a lot more of that nickel spot. And so, I think he's a guy that we saw in the spring playing in the nickel. He had a terrific interception against Boyle that he returned for a pick six in OTAs. And look, he's a veteran guy. He's physical. He's got kind of that knack for inside. I think if there's one maybe knock on AJ is the size, even though he definitely showed last year that he can come up and stick somebody. He did get injured, did miss some games. And I think that's going to be an interesting battle there with him and Mike Hughes. And then to me, Chase Lucas, right? A guy that the Lions drafted this year too, played a lot in the slot in the spring. A guy that's got a ton of experience, started a lot of games in college, played both inside and outside, so has experience at both. I think, those three guys in particular, I think it's going to be really interesting maybe who kind of, separates themselves into that starting nickel spot. That's, something I think we should really, focus in on, look at when camp starts. I think that's going to be a really important position battle just because of, like I talked about, just the value of that position is so huge in the NFL nowadays. So I think that slot spot's going to be interesting. How, Jeff Okudah, plays, looks, develops early on in camp. And then I think it'll be interesting too when Jerry Jacobs is ready to return. Now here's a guy like AJ Parker, was undrafted, earned a spot on this roster, and look, just kept showing out in practice, finally got his opportunity to play, and he played really well. I mean, he is, he's a bulldog and a pit bull, I think was what the coaches referred to him as. Look, he's a physical guy. He likes to get his hands, on receivers. He doesn't mind coming up and being physical in the run game. Now, unfortunately, tore his ACL in December. And so, like we talked about with Williams, that could be a start of camp on PUP, and then we'll just have to see where that goes. Can he get back before the start of the season? Is he a guy that starts season on PUP? But at some point, Jerry Jacobs is going to be back. And I can tell you this, any coach I've talked about, special teams coaches, Aubrey Pleasant, defensive backs coach Aaron Glenn, loves Jerry Jacobs. They just love the way the guy approaches the game, approaches every day here, his attitude. He's the kind of guy that they just like on this roster. And so now you've got Jeff Okudah, you've got Amani Oruwariye, you've got Jerry Jacobs. So where does this all kind of fit in there? And I think that'll be really interesting to watch through camp and see how that plays out. Look, it's a good problem to have, right? If you can't get a guy like Jerry Jacobs, on the field except for some situations, then that means you've built some depth to your football team. And could the Lions decide maybe to move him inside because they like him so much if Jeff and Amani are playing really well? So I think there's a lot of moving parts there at the cornerback spot, and I think you've got to talk about Will Harris and if Ifeatu Melifonwu when we're talking about cornerback spot too. Ifeatu, I thought, played really well, had his best game at the end of the year after he came back from that, thigh injury. It was a tough injury. He got his opportunity to start in Green Bay because of injury, and then boom, he's down for, misses, more than half the year. And then Will Harris, started at safety, was moved to cornerback just out of necessity because of all the injuries the Lions suffered at the cornerback spot last year, and played pretty well at that spot. And he was exclusively a cornerback this offseason. So I think that's going to be kind of a position switch for Will Harris. There could be some situations where they use him as a matchup piece, and maybe he plays the dime or he becomes a third safety in some looks, but he was really running almost exclusively as a cornerback in the spring. So we'll have to see if that is the case when we start training camp. And then Ifeatu is, 6'3". They love his size, and he's a guy that switched from cornerback to safety really all camp. They really view him as a matchup piece. Like we talked about with Harris, he's a guy that could maybe step in, play some dime stuff, play inside in some certain situations, match up against tight ends. Now, they really want to have the freedom to move him around, so they moved him from the cornerback room to the safety room and vice versa really all spring. They want him to learn, both spots, and that'll be an interesting one too. If you get a big receiver, just if you come in and play a little bit more. So, that'll be, to me, an interesting, dynamic there. Kind of where do those two guys fit in the greater mix of the cornerback position? But overall, I think that's a spot. Obviously the Lions have to get, better play from the cornerback position. Got it from Amani, got that ball production with the 6 picks, but they need somebody else to step up on the other side. You can avoid one guy, right? You really got to have 2, 3 guys, 4 guys that can be productive. You look at the really productive secondaries, they get ball production and good play from the cornerback position, and that's just a reality. And the Lions need that if they're going to take that next step forward on defense. And another position group I don't think has been talked about a lot, but it's one that's obviously important, and I think will be an interesting battle. We got to flip the page here for the notes. Is the kicker position? Look, the Lions kind of went through some, kind of issues there at the end of camp, not really happy with what they had, still kind of trying to figure it out as they went into the year. They bring in Austin Siebert, and, he was really good for them. 10 of 12 kicking field goals, 5 of 5 extra points, but then he gets hurt and injures a hip, has to end up on IR, so the team goes and signs Riley Patterson off the New England practice squad. And all Riley does is come in and make 13 of 14 field goals, make all 16 of his extra point attempts, and really stabilize that position, for Detroit, heading through the rest of the year. And so, look, Austin's back now. You've got Riley. Both guys, when given the opportunity to play, perform pretty well. And so I think that'll be an interesting battle as camp goes on. And just one side note to that, when I was watching those guys in the spring, a little bit disappointed with the number of misses. Now look, they could have been working on things that we don't know about. It's spring. Guys are running around in helmets and shorts. We're not going to make a huge deal of it. But there were quite a few missed field goals between both guys. So I think just for me, I'd like to see that stuff shored up a little bit. Both guys are going to get, I think, an equal opportunity to win the job. And look, you guys know, we all know how important that position is. It make or break the end of a game. You just go back to that Baltimore game, and when you've got a guy like Tucker that can do what he did, that wins you a game, right? Now, neither of those guys are going to kick a 66-yard field goal, I don't think, but you want those guys to be consistent. That when, Dave Phipp calls upon those guys, end of the game situation, right? That, you've got confidence like we saw last year that those guys can make kicks. And so to me, that'll be an interesting one, kind of who separates themselves, how much will kickoffs maybe play into that? Will Jack Fox be involved in that or not? Will that be a deciding factor? But really it's just going to come down to practice kicks and preseason kicks and best guy wins. And that's going to be an important position for Detroit. Obviously it is with, the other 31 teams as well. Another position group I'll be watching. So, look, backup quarterback spot. What are they going to do at linebacker? The cornerback position, kicker, and, that wide receiver room and how that plays out. Maybe, the 5th, 6th, 7th spot, what happens with Williams. I think those will all be really interesting things that I'll have my eye on, and I'll obviously be, keeping you guys abreast of what's going on every day. I'll have daily observations. We're 1 week away, and how fun, right? Fans are going to be back in Allen Park. The atmosphere is great. This team is much more improved, specifically offensively. I think this team could be fun to watch, guys. I think it'll be really interesting to start this team. You saw, Peter King and what he wrote, and thinking that maybe he thinks this might be a little bit better football team than people think going in. And so, there's a lot of excitement here in Allen Park. It's going to be really fun when it gets kicking. And like I said, those are 5 things that I'll be looking at specifically, but there's so much more. So obviously stay tuned. We're going to get into some of you guys' questions on the podcast next week. I'm going to get some analysts in here. We're going to start having players in once camp and the season starts. So we're going to get you guys kind of really involved in what's going on here early and often with this podcast and with all the articles on DetroitLions.com. So stay tuned, and next week we'll have a great show. Thank you guys for joining me. And look, camp's a week away. How fun, right?